I am James Altucher, and pleased today to be interviewing Jim McKelvey, the founder of Square and also the author of a book called The Innovation Stack, Building an Unbeatable Business One Crazy Idea at a Time. And it really is one crazy idea at a time. Like, just to introduce Jim a little further, founder of Square, he's a deputy chairman of the St. Louis Federal Reserve, and he is a glassblower. So before starting Square with his co-founder, Jack Dorsey, who is also the co-founder of Twitter, Jim's focus was creating art out of glass. And it's probably the least likely person you would think to start not only a multi-billion dollar company, but perhaps the most innovative company to come out of financial technology in the past 30 or 40 years, although maybe Jim would dispute that. But
No, keep
Jim,
going.
Jim, I love this title, The Innovation Stack, but you even talk about it in the book. Words like innovation, disruption, these are almost like almost meaningless. They're used so much. And the one thing I hear over and over again in every industry is people say, "Oh, it's too late. It's too late for me now. It's too late to build a billion-dollar company in the internet. It's too late to build a billion-dollar company using AI or Bitcoin or crypto or whatever." And here you had this glass factory, and why did you think you could build one of the most innovative companies out there? Again, something like a third of U.S. businesses use Square now to process credit cards. What was going through your head? It is a crazy idea.
Well, so first of all, James, we didn't think that we were going to be building this, behemoth. We thought we were going to be solving a small problem. And what it turns out is that there's a certain formula where if you try to do something that's never been done before, you're left without the tools that everybody else uses. So you have to invent your own stuff. And that's what I, describe as an innovation stack. It's the series of inventions that you have to do something that's totally new. And, yeah, I mean, look, I had the same feeling, which is, all the good ideas have been taken. You've got, and you look around you and you say, boy, I wish I'd thought of Uber, or boy, I wish I'd thought of, whatever, the hot idea this week is. And it's easy to think that there are no good ideas left. But the problem is that's the mentality that we're all sort of steeped in, which is this mentality of copying. And look, you and I and every human on the planet are really good copiers. If we weren't good at copying, we wouldn't be alive. But the fact is, you're not going to build a significant disruptive business or a significant sort of empowering business unless you do something unique. And unfortunately, you can't do something unique if all you can do is copy.
And so just to clarify, what's an example of a copy business?
Oh,
because
well,
some
that's
copy businesses are successful. Like Burger King is a successful copy of McDonald's.
Yeah, that's a great example. So how about high-tech software as a service business? So I'm a VC. I invest in these companies, and they're clones of each other. We find companies that have SaaS models. They have a certain little expertise that we think some bank or financial institution is going to buy later. They have a certain annual revenue, and you just crank and repeat. Now, that's not to say it's easy. That's not to say that success is guaranteed, but there's a model you can follow. And if you ever get to the point where you don't understand something, you can look at competitors or similar companies and just emulate what they did, and probably you'll get the same results that they got. So in a situation like that, copying is really a great idea. So I'm not trying to knock copying at all. As a matter of fact, I think copying is usually appropriately the first choice for solving a problem. But occasionally you run against a problem that humankind hasn't solved yet. And in that situation, you can't copy. And in that situation, also, you're going to have this almost physiological response, which is fear. I mean, it's basically fear, and it manifests in a bunch of ways. But basically, as soon as you are unable to copy or unable to verify that what you're doing is sort of approved by the herd, you'll start feeling very nervous. You'll doubt yourself, and you'll tend to quit before you get the ultimate success.
And I feel so Square solves this enormous problem, which is that small mom and pop companies, like let's take your local cafe or coffee shop or flower store or whatever, small mom and pop companies weren't able to accept credit cards. Why weren't they able to accept it? And given the fact that credit card companies specifically did not allow these companies to accept it, why did you think you could break through and, again, do I use the word disrupt or innovate? I don't know, but why did you think you would be able to do this and solve a problem for tens of millions of businesses?
So again, we weren't thinking that big at the beginning. I mean, we sort of had these dreams, but we were really trying to solve a problem for very specific small merchants. And I was one, so it was really easy. I mean, we had a focus group of me, and it was like, well, what would Jim use? And then we found a flower vendor who sold flowers literally in front of Jack's apartment in San Francisco. So she was our second user. We found a Russian stunt pilot to be our third user. So yeah, we had this sort of hodgepodge of people. But the pattern that I saw, which sort of led to this book, was not just what happened to Square, but what's happened to literally hundreds of other companies throughout history that have tried to enable small people to participate. So Square's a great example, but I think probably a better example, Southwest Airlines. Because if you look at the history of air travel, before Southwest Airlines in the United States, if you were not rich or you were not on a business account, you weren't flying, you were taking a bus. And Herb Kelleher and his team at Southwest really changed that, but they changed it not by trying to build the biggest airline in the country, which they actually eventually did, or by trying to create the highest growing company for a decade, the best performing stock in the NASDAQ, which I think they also did. But they were just trying to solve a problem for normal people. And when I say normal people, I mean people that aren't originally invited to the party. And that's sort of this pattern that I saw, which is that these people who go out and try to create solutions for this unknown market end up sometimes creating innovation stacks, which then lead to entirely new industries. So focus on the small. It's very powerful.
Yeah, it's not quite an unknown market. It seems like a lot of these companies that you feature in the innovation stack, the book, and as well as your own company, Square, focus on the potential bottom third or bottom fourth of an industry. So again, huge companies were able to accept credit cards. It was the small companies that, for whatever reason, could not physically accept credit cards. And similarly with Southwest Airlines, it was people who normally couldn't afford air travel that Southwest, it was like the bottom third of people who would like to travel. That was the industry that Southwest served. So, but what are the problems that are results? One is you have to provide the service cheaply. The other is there was an oligopoly of credit card companies. Maybe there were 2 or 3 credit cards that you had to focus on, and they simply didn't want to process credit cards for small companies. Like in the first 5 minutes of considering starting Square, if it were me, I'd probably say, oh, we would never be able to, what happens if we don't convince Visa and MasterCard and American Express to accept our card or to accept our card reader? Well, we would be over. How do we fight that? Like, why did you think, and again, this is for everybody out there, how do they overcome the extreme doubt with good reason? How do they overcome that in the beginning?
So the extreme doubt is part and parcel of doing something that hasn't been done before. So I'll use a travel analogy. Okay, if I'm going to take a trip, which I wish I could take a trip, we're all locked down with COVID, but like if I could travel right now and I was going to a different city or flying to a different country, I would have some expectations. I would expect there to be transport and food and maybe a hotel. And if I got to the hotel, I'd expect there to be a bed. And I have these certain expectations. Now, that's totally different from me taking a trip where, I'm shoved out into some uncharted jungle and have to survive. Now, both are traveling, but in one case, I assume a series of resources that I depend on. And in the other case, I'm sort of on my own. And imagine your shock if somebody says, hey, James, let's take a trip. And we're going to go, to this really cool resort. And then they shove you in a jungle. That's what it's like if you end up at the bottom of the market. So what you described in your question was something that I illustrate in the book, which is sort of like this there's this pyramid in most markets where, up at the top you have, super expensive products that are, sort of the luxury primo products. And then it gets, more and more commoditized as you go down. But at some point the market stops. And you'll see that for everything. So right now I'm fascinated with diapers. Got a little kid. We use a lot of diapers. But if you look at the diaper, the diaper pretty much stops at about 18 cents. Like if you don't have 18 cents to spend on a disposable diaper, you're not going to use a diaper. And for poor people, it's even worse. Poor people are spending almost double that for diapers. But if you can't afford that, your kid doesn't use diapers, or if they do, they have they have to basically wear them all day. So if you look at any market, there's a point where that market just can no longer affordably service the lower edge, and the market stops. So in the case of Southwest Airlines, at the time, the way they were flying planes prevented them from charging the rates that Southwest did. So what Southwest had to do was they had to create an entirely new, different series of innovations. What was Southwest's innovation stack? To allow them to provide that service for everybody. And then the same thing happened with Square. Like when we started trying to serve small merchants like me, we realized that not only did the rest of the market sort of ignore that segment, but they had built their systems in a way that presumed that segment was never going to be addressed. So Square couldn't connect to the banks the way the other companies could. We couldn't fight fraud the way everybody else did. Basically, all the tools that everybody else was using were unavailable to us. So we were forced to invent all these new tools. And I go through the book that we did about 14 things differently that had never been done in the credit card market before. And that innovation stack allowed Square to become what it is today.
And so a lot of these problems that you encounter, you don't necessarily know what these problems are going to be in advance, but it's through encountering problems and building the tools to solve those problems that it's almost like you have faith that you'll be able to build an innovation stack and solve these problems, and that's what will create the company. Did you have faith in the beginning that you would solve the problems, or did you completely have no clue that the problems would exist?
It was both. we had no clue, and we also had faith. So Jack and I both share a pretty stubborn streak. So when we would come up against something that couldn't be done. So for instance, we wanted to do an online user agreement. We thought, well, that's simple. Everyone does it for software. Just click agree and, get on with your life. But the credit card industry said, no, you have to have a 42-page typed 6-point type contract. It's got to be, wet ink signature, all this crap. And we said, well, that's stupid, but literally in the first day in the office, we discovered several laws that Square would be violating with each transaction. And by the end of the second week, we had identified 17 different rules, regulations, or in some cases laws that prevented Square from doing what it wanted to do. Now, where the naivete comes in, neither Jack nor I were experts in payments. We thought, well, why the hell can't we do this? Like what we want to do seems like something you should be able to do. So we just kept going. And we kept going. And after a year and a half, we finally got either compliant with all those laws, or in some cases, we got them changed.
Right. So while solving these problems, you basically built kind of the framework that built the whole company. So each step of the way, you encountered a problem, and being forced to solve it kind of solved many problems simultaneously. Like you mentioned diapers earlier. Amazon's a great example where they were competing against, or diapers.com ended up competing against Amazon. Amazon undercut them so much that they eventually were able to buy diapers.com, and you encountered problems with Amazon.com. So among all the many problems, you also had this huge giant say, "Hey, we're gonna attack this small company at the time, Square."
Yeah. So the diapers. It was terrifying. The diapers.com story is pretty interesting because I talked to both founders of diapers because what you said exactly was the same thing that happened to Square. So the scariest thing that can happen to you as a startup, I think, is Amazon decides they want your market. And what they do is they copy your product, they undercut your price, and then they add the Amazon brand and they expect you to die. And that's exactly what they did to diapers.com. And that's actually what they've done to hundreds of small companies. Amazon always wins when they do this. And I say always. The one exception that we found was Square itself. Like when Amazon did this to Square, for some reason, a year later, Amazon gave up the fight. And that was amazing to me. As a matter of fact, that's the whole reason I wrote this book, was because I couldn't explain why it happened. Like startups don't beat Amazon. Like what happened to diapers.com and happened to Zappos and happened to all these other companies, that's what's supposed to happen. But something happened differently in Square's case. And I was like, well, what explains this? And so I basically went on a research quest for a couple of years. And I was like, oh my God, what happened to Square was not an anomaly, but it was this very rare phenomenon. And the reason it was so rare is that because most companies don't have to innovate. And when I say have to innovate, look, I'm not sort of preaching innovation as this solution to everything. I sort of hate innovation. Okay, like it's unpleasant, it's scary, but it's one of those things that I'm willing to do when forced to. And most people and most companies are able to avoid it forever. And so what I noticed was there was a weird pattern because Square was not the only survivor. There were a bunch of other companies, Southwest and IKEA, and I found dozens of them that had the same pattern, which is as a startup, they were attacked by a much, much larger organization. Sometimes, in some cases, it was a government. In some cases, but in all cases, the startup survived. And they not only survived, but they grew to become the biggest company in their business. So like the biggest bank in the world was started by a guy who was a produce vendor, knew nothing about banking, was just pissed off at the banking system because it didn't include the little people. So again, the pattern repeats. AP Giannini built the biggest bank in the world by trying to include people who previously couldn't use banks.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I learned from your book was this idea that, hey, if you want to create $1 billion company, find an industry where the bottom third of people are not being served by that industry, but would like to be. So you mentioned Southwest catering to people who normally couldn't afford air travel, and Square catering to people who normally couldn't accept credit cards because they weren't big enough. And now you're handling about a third of American businesses. Was there ever a point, and again, that's always going to create a multi-billion-dollar company if you can create the right innovations along the way and deal with the competitors like Amazon who are going to try to squash you. Was there ever a point in this that, well, two questions. One is, was there ever a point in this where you were like, we put 4 years into this, 5 years into this, and now we're going to have to give up. I don't know how to solve this problem.
No. I will say that doesn't mean we weren't terrified when Amazon attacked us. But by the time Amazon attacked us, we were growing so fast and we were so busy that we basically ignored them. And it's not that we were ignoring Amazon, it's that we couldn't think of anything to do. So we just kept doing what we were doing. And I know that sounds insane, but that was really sort of the attitude of Square, which was like, we didn't lower our price to match their price. We basically didn't change anything. We just kept plowing ahead. But what's your second question?
The second question is, what other industries now do you think are so expensive they cannot, or so they're so expensive for people that they're ripe for this type of innovation? Like somebody should create a company to service the bottom 1/3 of this industry. And now some industries benefit from like a Moore's Law type approach. Like let's say I want to use genomics to cure some disease I have. A Moore's Law of genomics suggests that eventually genomics will be cheap enough to solve millions of diseases that they don't currently solve. So other than industries like that benefit from just increase in technology, what industries are sort of ripe for disruption because they're not serving the bottom 1/3 of society?
Well, I think it's almost every
It's
industry.
a hard question.
I mean, I spent a lot of time in St. Louis, Missouri. It's my hometown, and I sort of live and work on an area that's sort of on the edge. And so a lot of my friends, their kids are in different situations. I've got friends on both sides of what we call the Del Mar Divide here in St. Louis. So like if you don't think diapers is a problem, then you don't understand diapers. A third of Americans struggle to pay for diapers. Education, healthcare, anything like, and this is the reason I chose the examples in my book so carefully, is that I chose the most boring, commoditized industries I could to just prove the power of the innovation stack. So I think the great one is furniture. So you look at the biggest furniture company in the world, it's IKEA. What did IKEA do? Well, they created a new process. They created an innovation stack to bring furniture to the masses. And, when you and I went to college, we didn't have new furniture. Like we didn't have stuff that looked really cool. We had like stolen milk crates. At least that's what I had. It's not a it's not a sexy industry. Furniture is not some cool furniture. There's no Moore's law for furniture. Okay, but the power of innovation can even transform the furniture world. And it can create, multi-billion-dollar fortunes. I mean, the IKEA fortune is insanely valuable, even though they're private. So I don't want people to start thinking, oh, this is some tech guy who's telling me to, go start a tech company. No. Like, I'd love to see the world have a better diaper. Like, I would love to see the world have, more affordable sneakers. I believe there's opportunity at the bottom of most markets. It's just, you have to open up your eyes to what it takes to not copy. And that's really tough because, your whole life, you have been trained to copy. And actually, the book is dedicated to somebody who I think is brilliant. I know is incredibly gifted, well-educated. But every time I see her encounter a problem where she has not previously been trained to solve, she quits. She says, I'm not qualified to do this. And my point to her, which is, now 300 pages long, but my point to her is, look, you're right, you're not qualified. But the first time anything is done in human history, it's done by somebody who's not qualified, right? The Wright brothers, they flew the first airplane. Were either of them qualified? Absolutely not. You couldn't be qualified to fly a plane because humans hadn't flown before.
It's so interesting about the Wright brothers because at the same time that the Wright brothers, so they owned a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and they decided, we're going to build a plane and fly through the air, and no one's ever done it before. And at the same time, the U.S. government was devoting $2 million in $1,900 to Samuel Langley to also create a plane. And it was kind of a race between them. And it was almost the fact that the Wright brothers weren't well funded that forced them to kind of create the innovations they did. Like, and the big kind of technical sort of insight was that Samuel Langley was trying to build a plane that would have no turbulence. It would fly as straight as possible. And the Wright brothers, because their experience with bicycles, realized that when you learn to ride a bicycle, you wobble a little bit, and that's okay. That's how you find balance. And so planes wobble. And that was their big innovation in some sense, their first innovation.
Yeah, well, if you look at the plane, which I've studied a lot, it sounds like you have too. There are probably 20 serious innovations of the Wright Flyer. But you're absolutely right, and that is the Wright brothers also exhibit the pattern that I saw in the book, which is that all of these industries are founded by people who not only are not experts, because you can't be expert in something that hasn't been done, but they have almost no experience in the industry itself. So Jack and I knew nothing about payments. Kelleher knew nothing about aviation. Compra knew nothing about furniture. Like these were people who sort of ended up through happenstance in this industry where they were forced to invent, and they were forced to invent without the burden of too much knowledge to begin with. So they had this very open mind, and if it's a dihedral on the wing, or a aluminum engine, or a different way of warping the wing so you can steer. Like all of those things are things that people invent when they're forced to.
It also seems like, again, this is a great idea for a model for building $1 billion company. Find an industry that's not serving the bottom third of society. And you see this in a lot of cases with the access economy, like Uber, Zipcar. Here's somebody with a lot of access. Here's people who need access to cars or seats or houses or whatever. And kind of cutting out the middleman is a good way to reduce costs and serve that bottom third.
Look, yes, the interesting thing about innovation is that you get a different tool set every day. So I will agree that certain things were absolutely impossible to do 10 years ago. Are they impossible still? Is it still impossible? Well, we don't know, because every day we got a new set of tools. Somebody invents a new accelerometer, or a cheaper engine, or a better way of transmitting power, or we get a faster processor, or you figure out some new source of cobalt. The world keeps changing, so your resources keep changing. So don't tell me it's impossible.
Such an inspiration to think that, hey, the only thing really stopping somebody from starting $1 billion company is really just imagination and creativity. You have to find the industries where there's a problem. Some portion of society is not being served by this industry, and then look at all the different ways and the innovation stack you could build to solve those problems. Jim McKelvey, author of The Innovation Stack, which really describes in detail how this sort of innovation occurs and how he did it with Square. And again, Jim was a specialist in, creating glass art, blowing glass, and then he created the largest financial company in the world. Congratulations, Jim. It's a great book. It's such an interesting topic that we could talk for hours about this, and we have in the past. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for doing this interview. The Innovation Stack by Jim McKelvey, founder of Square.
Thanks, James. What a pleasure. And I love your podcast, man.